The 401st floor of the great tomb of Nazarick was silent, as it always was at this hour, not the silence of emptiness but the silence of absolute control. Every torch burned at the intensity Ainz Ooal Gown had specified. Every guardian stood at the post he had assigned. Every corridor, every trap, every ward layered atop ward, existed exactly as it had for the 2 years since the world itself had folded him into it, transformed a man named Mamanga into something that no longer needed to sleep, and yet still out of habit more than necessity, sat in his throne room at this hour reviewing reports by candlelight he did not need. Ainz Ooal Gown liked this hour. It was the one hour when nothing was expected of him. That was the hour the sky broke. It did not announce itself the way a storm does, with a gathering of cloud or a change in pressure. There was no warning at all. One moment the throne room's high windows showed the same starless dark that had hung over the new world every night since Nazarick's arrival there. The next moment that dark was wrong, not black but the absence of a concept, a wrongness so total that the mind slid off it rather than perceiving it directly, the way an eye refuses to focus on the sun. Ainz felt it before he understood it, a pressure behind the twin points of crimson light that served him as eyes, a pull that had no direction because it came from everywhere and nowhere, dragging at something inside him that was not flesh or bone but should nonetheless have been immovable. His first thought, absurdly, was that Demiurge had triggered some experimental ritual without authorization. His second thought, arriving a half-second later as the throne room itself seemed to tilt sideways through a dimension that had no name, was that he was wrong and that whatever was happening was so far beyond Nazarick's own magic that comparing it to a summoning circle was like comparing a candle to the sun. It could never be. The tomb groaned. Not metaphorically, the stone groaned, a low structural shudder that ran from the throne room down through 90 floors of dungeon, treasury, garden, and grave, as though the entire 9-layer fortress had been picked up by something incomprehensibly vast and was being turned over in an unseen palm. Ainz stood. It was the only thing his body did on instinct anymore, since instinct itself had become something he had to consciously cultivate. Stand. Look composed. Whatever is happening, look as though you commanded it to happen. The doors to the throne room burst open before he had finished the thought, and Albedo entered at a speed that would have been undignified in any other circumstance, her wings half unfurled, her expression caught between fear and fury on behalf of her lord. Behind her came Demiurge, unhurried as always but with his tail lashing in a way that betrayed him to anyone who had studied him as long as Ainz had. Lord Ainz. Albedo's voice cracked with an emotion that was not quite panic, because panic was not permitted in Nazarick's presence but sat close enough to it that Ainz could hear the effort of restraint. The wards all 9 floors report the same disturbance. Something has breached containment that we did not detect approaching. The dimensional stabilization array in the treasury has failed, Demiurge added, his tone maddeningly level even now. Not damaged, failed, as though it had never been activated at all. Ainz kept his skeletal face motionless, which was at least an advantage of his current body. No one could see that beneath the composed exterior something that had once been a very ordinary man was screaming. "Show me," he said instead, and his voice came out steady, resonant, exactly the voice of a being who had already anticipated this and was merely confirming details. 2 years of practice had made the performance nearly instinctive. Nearly. He walked to the great window, one of the few concessions to aesthetics in a throne room built for intimidation, and looked out at what should have been the dark canopy of the forest that had surrounded Nazarick since its arrival in this world. There was no forest. There was no ground. Where the new world's night sky should have hung, there was instead a churning, colorless vastness that Ainz's mind kept trying and failing to translate into something familiar, not the void of space as any astronomer would recognize it, but something with texture, with a pulse, as though he were looking not at emptiness but at the underside of something alive. Distant lights flared and died in patterns that suggested neither stars nor magic. And cutting across all of it, faint as a hairline fracture in glass, ran threads of color that should not exist in any spectrum Ainz's centuries of study, real and borrowed both, had ever catalogued. Report from every guardian, Ainz said. Now. What came back, floor by floor, was the same story with only minor variation. No attack detected, no intrusion registered, no enemy presence of any kind, and yet every single divination, every scrying pool, every ward key to detect Nazarick's location relative to its surroundings returned nothing. Not false readings, not corrupted readings. Nothing, as though the concept of location itself had briefly stopped applying to the great tomb of Nazarick. Cocytus arrived to report the 6th floor secure, his massive frame filling the doorway. ice forming faintly at his footsteps as it always did when his composure frayed even slightly. "This one detects no hostile magic," he said. "This is not a spell Cocytus recognizes. This one wonders if it is a spell at all." That Ainz thought was the most useful thing anyone had said so far, because it was the same conclusion he had already reached, and had been hoping desperately someone would contradict. He had built an empire on the foundation of never admitting uncertainty. Nazarick's 41 floor guardians, its army, its administrative apparatus down to the last homunculus maid, existed within a structure that assumed their supreme leader always knew more than he revealed, that his silences were strategic rather than symptomatic of a man in a skeleton's body trying desperately to look like he'd read the last chapter of a book he'd actually never finished. That structure was about to be tested in a way it had never been tested before, because for the first time since he had woken in this world, Ainz Ooal Gown had absolutely no idea what was happening to him. The pull came again, sharper this time, and the throne room lurched, not physically, precisely, but in a way every soul inside it registered as motion nonetheless. Somewhere below, he heard the distant, distorted toll of the tomb's warning bells, a sound designed to alert every level to a crisis, and which had never in 2 years actually needed to ring. Lord Ainz. Albedo was at his side now. Close enough that he could see genuine fear behind the devotion in her eyes, fear not for herself, he understood, but for him, which was somehow worse. "Whatever is happening, command us. We stand ready to give everything in your defense. Give everything in my defense against what." Ainz thought and felt something colder than his undead body should have been capable of feeling. "I don't know what we're defending against. I don't know where we're going. I don't even know if going is the right word for whatever this is." But he was Ainz Ooal Gown, ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick, and 141 NPCs believed without question that he had already anticipated this moment. "This," he said, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate rather than desperate, "is an old contingency. One I did not expect to need and did not wish to burden any of you with prematurely." The lie left him with the ease of long practice, and he despised himself for how easy it had become. And he told it anyway, because the alternative was a throne room full of the beings he loved most in any world discovering that their god was in this moment exactly as lost as they were. "Whatever occurs in the coming hours," he continued, "I require calm, full defensive posture on every floor. No guardian is to act independently. We do not yet know what we are facing, and until we do, discipline is our greatest asset." It was, he reflected distantly, a remarkably good lie, precisely because every word of it was also entirely true. The colorless vastness beyond the window began to compress, the strange threaded lights growing brighter, closer, resolving with sickening speed into something that finally looked like it might be a place rather than a concept, jagged shapes that might have been structures or wreckage, or something with no equivalent Ainz's vocabulary contained. The pull sharpened into something almost violent, and for 1/2 second that felt endless, every soul inside the great tomb of Nazarick felt the sensation of being poured through the eye of a needle threaded by something ancient beyond comprehension. Then it stopped. The throne room settled with a shudder that rattled dust from the ceiling for the first time in the tomb's history. Outside the window, the churning colorless vastness was gone, replaced by an ordinary night sky, black and star-strewn and utterly silent, hanging over a landscape that was unmistakably, wrongly, not the new world at all, jagged rust-colored hills under a sky with too many dead stars and one small, sickly moon the color of an old bruise. Ainz stood very still, processing the fact that Nazarick, all 9 floors, every guardian, every treasure, every soul under his protection, had just been torn from one world and set down, entire and intact, somewhere else, somewhere he did not recognize. Somewhere that he was beginning to suspect with a dread he refused to let show on his skeletal face, did not officially exist in any record Nazarick itself possessed. "Albedo," he said, and was faintly, privately relieved that his voice still carried the weight of command. "Assemble the guardians, full council immediately." "You Lord Ainz?" she asked. "What will you tell them?" He looked out at the alien sky a moment longer, at the dead stars and the sick little moon, and thought, "I have absolutely no idea, and that terrifies me more than anything has since I woke up in this body." "I will tell them," Ainz said, "exactly as much as they need to know." Word count? 2,187. If you want to see more god-tier civilizations dropped into the grimdark heart of the 41st millennium, hit that subscribe button and drop what faction you want to see Nazarick encounter first in the comments below. The council chamber on the 9th floor was not designed for uncertainty. Every seat around the long obsidian table had been placed with a specific hierarchy in mind, every guardian's position chosen to reflect not just their floor but their proximity to Ainz Ooal Gown's confidence. And as the 41 floor guardians and their represented factions filed in, taking those same seats out of 2 years of habit, Ainz understood with a clarity that made his non-existent stomach twist that he was about to sit at the head of that hierarchy and admit, in the most careful language he could construct, that he did not know where they were, why they had been moved, or what had reached through reality itself to move them. He could not say that, not directly, not in those words. He took his seat. Albedo settled to his right, Demiurge to his left, and around the table the guardians arranged themselves in the silence that had become customary before Ainz spoke, a silence he had once found comforting in the early days, evidence of an order he had built. Tonight it felt like a held breath, reports, Ainz said, beginning with defensive status, Cossidus. Perimeter holds, Cossidus said. This one has extended ice formations to a distance of 400 meters in all directions. No hostile presence detected within that range. The terrain beyond is, he paused, searching for a word which was itself unusual for a guardian who rarely hesitated over anything. Barren rock and dust, no vegetation, no water sources identified. Atmospheric composition is breathable, Aura offered from further down the table, though her usual restless energy was subdued, her feet tucked beneath her chair instead of swinging as they normally did. I sent out 3 of my beasts to scout. They came back confused, I think, as much as beasts can be confused. They didn't like it out there. Define didn't like it, Ainz said. Aura frowned, working through how to translate an instinct into words a human, or whatever Ainz technically was now, might parse. Like something's watching that isn't actually watching. Mare felt it too. Beside her, Mare nodded miserably, shrinking slightly under the attention. The land doesn't feel right, Lord Ainz. It's not cursed exactly, it's not blessed either. It just feels like it's been through something, like it remembers pain but doesn't have anywhere to put it. It was, Ainz thought, an unsettlingly poetic description from the more timid of the twins, and worse, he suspected it was accurate. He filed it away. Divination, he said, turning to Demiurge. Status of the scrying attempts. This was the report he had been dreading, and Demiurge delivered it with his usual composure, which did nothing to soften the content. I have attempted 17 distinct divination rituals since our arrival, Lord Ainz. Location scrying, dimensional mapping, temporal displacement analysis, even the higher-tier rituals typically reserved for confirming the movement of world-class threats. He folded his hands on the table. Every single one has returned either total silence or, and I confess this troubles me, more active resistance, as though the magic itself is being unwritten before it can resolve. Unwritten, Ainz repeated. I do not have a better word for it, Lord Ainz. It is not that the rituals fail through insufficient power. I have channeled magic far in excess of what such divinations typically require. It is that the underlying logic the ritual depends upon does not appear to function correctly in this place, as though we have been placed somewhere the rules governing our magic were not designed to reach. Around the table, a ripple of unease passed through guardians who had spent 2 years believing themselves functionally unkillable within their own domain. Ainz kept his expression, such as it was, behind a skull, perfectly still, while internally cataloging a fact that made the pit of his stomach, which he did not technically possess, drop further. If Nazarick's own magic couldn't locate Nazarick, then whatever had moved them operated on principles so far beyond his understanding that he had no framework at all for predicting what came next. Sebas, Ainz said, turning to the one guardian whose report he actually anticipated with something other than dread. Your assessment of the tomb's structural integrity. Sebas Teto inclined his head with characteristic composure. Nazarick itself is unharmed, Lord Ainz. Every floor, every ward, every treasure remains exactly as it was prior to the displacement. Whatever force moved us took care not to damage what it moved, if I may offer an observation. Ahead. That care suggests intention rather than accident. A force capable of tearing an entire fortress from one reality and depositing it intact in another, and choosing to preserve that fortress rather than destroy it in the process, did not do so carelessly. Something wanted Nazarick here, whole. The chamber went very quiet. It was, Ainz reflected, exactly the conclusion he had already reached alone in the dark of the throne room in the minutes before this council convened, and hearing Seba's voice it aloud did not make it easier to sit with. Something had reached into a world that should have been sealed from any such interference, and had taken Nazarick, not destroyed it, not scattered it, not left it broken in transit, but relocated it entire with a precision that implied purpose. The question was not merely where. The question was why, and Ainz did not have the faintest beginning of an answer, and every soul in this room was looking at him as though he did. Your assessment is consistent with mine. Ainz said, which was true, and said nothing else, which was cowardice dressed as strategy. For now our priority is threefold. First, continued defensive posture, no Guardian acts without authorization, and no Guardian ventures beyond the current perimeter without an escort of at least 2 combat-capable units. Second, continued attempts at both magical and non-magical reconnaissance, prioritizing identification of any intelligent life in the vicinity. Third, he paused, not for effect this time, but because he genuinely did not know what the third priority should be and needed a half-second to invent one that sounded like wisdom rather than panic. Discretion, he finished. Whatever brought us here, whatever is watching this place, I do not want Nazarick's true capabilities revealed until I better understand what we are dealing with. If we encounter any local presence, response is to be measured. Contained. I would rather retreat from an unnecessary confrontation than reveal strength we may need to conserve for a genuine threat. It was good advice. It was also, he knew, advice born entirely from the fact that he had no idea what genuine threat in this place might actually look like, and preferred his guardians not find out the hard way before he did. The council dispersed with the disciplined efficiency Ainz had spent 2 years cultivating, guardians returning to their floors to implement the defensive posture he had ordered, and for the first time since the throne room had lurched sideways through a wrongness with no name, Ainz found himself alone, or as alone as he ever truly was, with Albedo lingering a respectful distance away, watching him with an intensity that suggested she suspected more than she said. Ainz, she said quietly once the chamber had emptied. May I speak candidly? You may. You are frightened. It was not a question, and Ainz felt absurdly a flicker of something like relief that at least one person in Nazarick was willing to say the thing everyone else was too disciplined to voice. I am uncertain, he said, choosing the word with the same care he chose every word in front of his guardians even now. There is a difference there. Albedo's golden eyes held no judgment, only a fierce, quiet loyalty that made the lie sit heavier in his throat than any lie had in months. You do not need to perform for me, my lord. I have loved you since before I had the capacity to choose to. I know your true face better than I know my own. Ainz was silent for a long moment, weighing, as he weighed everything, how much truth was safe to offer even here, even to her. I do not know what has happened to us, he admitted finally, the words costing him more than any tactical decision he'd made in 2 years. I do not know where we are, I do not know what reached into our world and moved us or why, and I do not know what it wants. Albedo absorbed this without flinching, which was, he thought, exactly why he had told her. Then we will learn, she said simply, together. And whatever comes for Nazarick will find that not knowing why we are here changes nothing about what we are capable of. It was not comfort, precisely. It was something better, conviction, offered without demanding he match it, and Ainz found himself grateful for it in a way he did not have words for. The alarm came 4 hours later. It reached Ainz through Aura, who burst into the throne room with none of her usual playful energy, her expression sharp and focused in a way that immediately told him this was not a false report. Lord Ainz, something's entered the outer perimeter, not walking, flying, metal. My beast caught the sound before I saw it. Don't think it knows we're here yet, Aura said. It's moving slow, searching pattern, not attack pattern, but it's heading straight for us. Ainz rose from his throne and felt, beneath the composed exterior he had perfected over 2 years, something that was almost relief. A tangible threat, however small, was infinitely easier to face than the shapeless uncertainty that had haunted him since the throne room lurched sideways through the wrongness. This at least he understood. This he could perform. Show me, he said, and followed Aura toward the surface. What emerged from the barren, bruised sky landscape surrounding Nazarick's newly relocated form was, to Ainz's eye, unlike anything the new world had produced. A small craft, perhaps the size of a modest carriage, hovering with no visible means of propulsion, its hull a scarred and pitted gray marked with symbols that meant nothing to him. A stylized eagle wrought in gold, rendered in a style that felt simultaneously ancient and mechanical, aggressive in a way that suggested whoever had designed it valued intimidation as much as function. It circled at a cautious distance, clearly having detected something about Nazarick's presence, the disturbance in the terrain, perhaps, or something more subtle, without yet comprehending what it had found. Ainz watched from the shadow of the tomb's outer wall, Aura beside him, Cossidus positioned a discreet distance away with a full detachment on standby, and felt the old, familiar calculation begin turning behind his skull's hollow eyes. Not fight or flight, but assessment, the same patient cataloging of unknowns that had governed every encounter since he'd woken into this world. Do not engage, he said quietly. Let it look, let it report to whatever sent it. I want to know who we're dealing with before they know what they're dealing with. Craft made 3 slow passes. Its scanning apparatus Ainz assumed that was its function, though the technology was unlike anything he could categorize, sweeping across the landscape, across the jagged rust-colored hills, and finally inevitably across the black stone edifice of Nazarick itself, rising from ground that had held nothing but barren rock hours before. The craft stopped. Even at this distance, Ainz could sense the shift in its behavior, the cautious searching pattern replaced by something sharper, more focused, the mechanical equivalent of a held breath. It hovered directly above the tomb's outer wall for nearly a full minute, and Ainz found himself wondering, with a detachment that surprised him, what exactly its occupants were seeing. A fortress that had not existed on any map, any survey, any record they possessed materialized whole in territory they presumably considered their own. Then the craft banked sharply and fled, not the slow, searching retreat of a scout satisfied with its findings, but a full, desperate burn toward the horizon, the kind of flight that spoke of genuine alarm. They saw us, Aura said, and they didn't like what they saw. Ainz agreed. They did not. He watched the craft shrink into the star-strewn dark, calculating. A scout, clearly reconnaissance rather than an attack force, which told him something useful about whoever controlled this territory. They valued information before commitment, which suggested either discipline or fear, and possibly both. And the speed of its retreat told him something more troubling still. Whatever authority that craft answered to would know within hours, if not sooner, that something had appeared in their territory that had not been there before. He had wanted discretion. He had wanted time to understand this place before revealing Nazarick's presence to it. That option, he now understood with cold clarity, had likely just evaporated. Recall the detachment, Ainz said. Full defensive posture, all floors immediately. Whatever comes next, I want us ready before it arrives. You think they'll return with force, Cocytus said. It was not quite a question. I think, Ainz said, watching the point on the horizon where the craft had vanished, that we have just been discovered by someone who is very frightened of what they found, and frightened people are rarely predictable. We will not have long to prepare for whatever they decide to do about us. He turned back toward the tomb, already composing in his mind the words he would use to brief his guardians, words that would sound as they always did. Like the calm pronouncements of a being who had anticipated every possibility, when the truth was that Ainz Ooal Gown had never in either of his lives felt less certain of what was coming, or less equipped to face it, and had never been more determined that not one of the 141 souls who called him Lord would ever know it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he suspected, reports were already being filed, alarms already being raised, and questions already being asked about the black fortress that had appeared from nowhere in territory that belonged, by ancient and bloody right, to an Imperium that tolerated no anomalies it did not understand. Ainz Ooal Gown had no way of knowing that name yet. He would learn it soon enough. And when he did, he would discover that the fear in that fleeing craft's flight path was not fear of an unknown threat at all. It was fear of a Xenos incursion, a category of horror the Imperium of man had spent 10,000 years learning never, ever to underestimate. The scout craft's pilot did not stop shaking until well after the transport had cleared the debris field and re-entered the relative safety of contested space. And even then, Provost-sanctioned voidsman Krillian Os found his hands would not fully obey him as he keyed the Vox array to route an emergency transmission to Battlefleet Command. This is Scout Vessel * Watchful Ember, designation OS-72, requesting immediate priority channel to Sector Command. He stopped, aware that what he was about to report would sound, to anyone who had not seen it, like the ravings of a man who had spent too long alone in the warp-touched dark of this dead system. I have visual confirmation of a structure. Unregistered, non-imperial construction. It was not present on any prior survey of the system, including the survey I conducted personally 11 days ago. Response, when it came, carried the flat, clipped irritation of an officer who had heard 1,000 panic reports from junior voidsmen and expected this to be the 1,001st false alarm. Explain structure, voidsman. Debris field, derelict hulk. Negative, sir. Intact, fortified, design unlike anything in Imperial Archive, Xenos Archive, or Heretical Archive I have clearance to compare against. Estimated mass. He checked his readings again, hoping the number would have changed, that his instruments had simply malfunctioned. They had not. Estimated mass consistent with a small hive city. It was not there, sir. I surveyed this exact coordinate 11 days ago and there was nothing but rock. Silence on the other end of the Vox lasted long enough that Oss began to fear the connection had failed. When the officer spoke again, his voice had lost its irritation entirely, replaced by something colder and far more attentive. Voidsman Oss, you will hold current course, transmit full sensor logs immediately upon docking, and you will not, I repeat, will not discuss what you observed with anyone outside command clearance. Is that understood? Understood, sir. Command out. Oss stared at the now silent Vox array for a long moment, his hands finally steadying now that the report had left his lips and become, officially, someone else's problem. He did not know, and would never learn, that his sensor logs would be flagged within the hour for review by an authority far above Sector Command. An authority whose interest was drawn not merely by an unregistered structure appearing from nowhere in Imperial-claimed space, but by a secondary reading buried in his instrument's background data, one he had not even noticed amid his panic. A null reading? A total absence of any detectable psychic resonance, in a location that should have registered at least the faint ambient hum every inhabited or recently inhabited structure left in the warp's shallow currents. Nothing left, no trace. This left less than nothing. And in the Imperium of man, an absence like that did not go unnoticed for long. Back within Nazarick, Ainz stood once more at the great window of his throne room, watching the horizon where the fleeing craft had vanished, and found himself running through the same calculation for perhaps the 10th time since the retreat. What have I revealed, and to whom? Albedo entered without announcement, a privilege he extended to almost no one else, and came to stand beside him close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his robes. The Guardians are unsettled, she said. Not afraid. Nazarick does not know fear where you are concerned, my lord, but unsettled. They do not like waiting for an enemy whose face they haven't seen. Neither do I, Ainz admitted, quietly enough that it felt almost like a confession. I built a philosophy of leadership on the premise that I always understood more than I revealed. Everything since we arrived here has been an exercise in discovering how much of that was performance and how much I actually believed. Does it matter which it was? Albedo asked. You have led us through worse uncertainty than this, my lord, even if you did not call it that at the time. Ainz considered this, considered the 2 years since his awakening in this body, the constant, exhausting labor of projecting a confidence he rarely fully possessed, the way that performance had gradually become something closer to genuine competence simply through the relentless practice of pretending it already existed. Perhaps Albedo was right. Perhaps the distinction between performed confidence and real confidence mattered less than the outcomes both produced. It was, he thought, cold comfort against an unknown enemy in an unknown world, but it was the only comfort available to him tonight. Have Demiurge continue the divination attempts, Ainz said. Even failed rituals may yield fragments of information. And have Sebas begin compiling everything we've observed about this place, the terrain, the craft's design, its markings, its retreat pattern. If we cannot yet know who rules this territory, we can at least begin building a portrait of them from what they leave behind. If they return with greater numbers, Ainz turned from the window, and though his face could show nothing beyond the fixed architecture of bone, something in his bearing straightened, settled, the performance and the genuine resolve beneath it finally, briefly, indistinguishable from one another. Then Nazarick will show them exactly why appearing in their territory uninvited was the least concerning thing about us. Outside, the bruised little moon climbed higher over a landscape that had, until hours ago, been utterly empty, and somewhere beyond the horizon machinery of war 10,000 years in the making had already begun, ponderously and inexorably, to turn its attention toward the black fortress that should not exist. 3 days passed before the Imperium returned, and Ainz Ooal Gown spent every hour of them constructing the performance he would need for what came next. He did not sleep, could not in the strictest sense, though he still observed something like a nightly ritual of solitude in his throne room, a habit carried over from a body that no longer required it. In those hours, alone but for Albedo's watchful presence at the chamber's edge, Ainz turned over the fragments Sebas had compiled. The scout craft's design, aggressive and utilitarian, wrought with an aesthetic that fused religious iconography with brutal function in a way that suggested a civilization that worshipped as fiercely as it warred. The golden eagle motif, repeated across every surface of the vessel Aura's beasts had tracked. The retreat pattern that spoke of discipline rather than panic, a military culture that valued reporting threats over confronting them alone, He had built from these scraps a working theory. Whatever authority controlled this territory was martial, hierarchical, and almost certainly paranoid about the unknown. That paranoia could be dangerous. It could also, Ainz suspected, be useful. A paranoid enemy was often a predictable one, provided you understood what frightened it. Demiurge's divination attempts had yielded nothing further, each ritual dissolving into the same unsettling silence as before, and that failure gnawed at Ainz more than he let any guardian see. In 2 years of ruling Nazarick, magic had never once failed him this completely, this consistently. Whatever this place was, it did not merely resist his understanding. It seemed to actively refuse to be understood by the tools he had always relied upon. Which meant that when contact came again, he would be improvising further into the dark than he had ever improvised before. It came on the 4th day, and it came in force. Cocytus brought the report personally, his massive frame filling the throne room's entrance with an urgency that cut through even his customary formality. Multiple contacts, Lord Ainz. Ground forces approaching from the northeast at marching pace. Estimated strength, several hundred infantry supported by armored vehicles and at least one aerial escort. They are not attempting concealment, they wish to be seen approaching. A show of force, Ainz said, rather than an ambush. That tells us something. Tells us they believe several hundred soldiers in armor sufficient to overawe whatever they found here, Demiurge observed, a note of something that might have been amusement threading through his usual composure. A charming miscalculation. Or a calculated one, Ainz countered. They may intend the display purely as a prelude to negotiation, not conquest, a show of capability, not an opening move. He rose from his throne, already feeling the familiar tightening of focus that came before any performance that mattered. Full defensive posture on the outer floors, but no visible mobilization beyond what is already in place. I want them to see strength they cannot fully measure, not strength arrayed for battle. Let them wonder what we have not shown them. And when they arrive, Albedo asked. When they arrive, Ainz said, I will meet them myself. The chamber went very still. It was Sebas who finally spoke the objection every guardian in the room was clearly restraining. Lord Ainz, with respect, we do not yet understand this enemy's capabilities. To expose yourself directly is exactly what a being who has nothing to fear from them would do, Ainz finished. Sebas, consider our position. We do not know what these people are capable of. We do not know why we are here, or what watches us from beyond this world's own edges. What we do have, the only advantage I can currently identify, is that they do not know what we asterisk are capable of either. If I hide within these walls and let them wonder, they may conclude caution is warranted, or they may conclude the opposite, that we hide because we are weak. I would rather control that impression directly than leave it to their imagination. It was, he knew even as he said it, a genuine strategic calculation and also simultaneously, the same performance he had built his entire rule upon, the conviction that appearing to have already solved a problem was often the fastest way to actually solve it. He did not know, standing in his throne room with 3 days of failed divination behind him and an army approaching from the northeast, whether he was being brave or reckless. He had long since stopped being certain there was a meaningful difference between the two, so long as the outcome favored Nazarick. I will accompany you, Albedo said. It was not a request. As will I, said Demiurge. Ainz considered refusing, weighing the optics of arriving with an escort against the optics of arriving alone, and concluded that a measure of retinue actually served his purposes better. A being with nothing to prove did not need to demonstrate isolation as evidence of confidence. Very well, the two of you and a guard of 6 from Cocytus's forces, positioned visibly but not aggressively. I want this to look like an audience being granted, not a confrontation being prepared for. They met the Imperial column a half-kilometer beyond Nazarick's outer wall, in the flat expanse of rust-colored ground that Ainz had already begun privately to think of as a negotiating table the size of a small country. The column stopped a respectful but wary distance away, and from its center a smaller party detached itself and approached on foot, a deliberate choice, Ainz noted, meant to signal something between diplomacy and confidence. The figure who led them was armored in a manner that immediately marked him as different from the soldiers flanking him. Heavier plate, ornate in a way that suggested rank rather than mere function, a long coat marked with symbols of authority Ainz did not recognize but understood instinctively to be significant. His face, visible beneath a raised visor, was hard-lined and weathered, the face of a man who had survived a great many things that should have killed him and had stopped being surprised by any of them. I am Colonel Militant Aurelio Vantras, the man said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, acting under sanction of the Departamento Munitorum and the Astra Militarum garrison of this sector. You occupy Imperial claimed territory without registration, without sanction and without explanation. I am authorized to demand both your identity and your intentions, and I am authorized to escalate should those demands go unanswered. Ainz let the silence stretch for exactly as long as he judged useful, long enough to unsettle, not so long as to seem evasive, before responding. I am Ainz Ooal Gown, he said, ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick. He gestured a small, unhurried motion toward the black spires rising behind him. As for your claim to this territory, I would ask you to consider the possibility that territorial claims made in ignorance of what already occupies that territory carry rather less weight than you may assume. It was a calculated provocation, deployed with precision, not enough to invite immediate violence, but enough to establish in a single sentence that Ainz did not consider himself the supplicant in this exchange. Vantras's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and behind him, Ainz noted several of the soldiers shift their grips on their weapons, though none raised them. This system has been surveyed and catalogued by Imperial authority for over 4 centuries, Vantras said. Your structure did not exist 11 days ago. I have the sensor logs to confirm it. You will explain how a fortification of this scale appeared from nothing in Imperial territory, or you will be treated as the Xenos incursion your presence suggests. There it was, the word Ainz had been waiting for, the framework through which this civilization apparently understood any unexplained presence. Xenos. He filed the term away, extrapolating from tone and context. Whatever it meant precisely, it was clearly a category this Colonel Militant regarded with reflexive, institutional hostility, and Ainz understood immediately that being sorted into that category would not go well for anyone involved. This was the moment. The bluff had to land here or not at all. Colonel Militant Vantras, Ainz said, letting his voice settle into the register he had spent 2 years perfecting, measured, unhurried, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a being entirely unconcerned by the threat implied in the soldier's posture around him. I will offer you a courtesy few extend to those who approach with an army at their back and demands rather than questions. I will tell you what I am prepared to tell you and no more, and I would suggest you consider carefully whether pressing for more serves your interests. He paused, exactly long enough. Nazarick's arrival here was not an accident, nor an intrusion, nor an act of aggression against your Imperium. It was the result of forces and calculations that predate any survey your authority has ever conducted of this system. Forces I am neither obligated nor, frankly, inclined to explain to a colonel standing at the edge of my domain with soldiers he cannot afford to lose. What I can tell you is this: Nazarick did not come here to make war upon you. Whether it leaves here at peace is a matter that depends entirely on choices your Imperium has not yet made. It was, Ainz reflected even as he delivered it, a masterpiece of saying almost nothing while sounding as though he had revealed a great deal, every sentence technically true, artfully arranged to suggest an intentionality and control he did not remotely possess. He did not know why Nazarick had arrived. He did not know what forces had moved it. He was gambling entirely, on the hope that a being who spoke with this much unshaken confidence would be assumed to actually possess the power his tone implied. Vantras studied him for a long moment, and Ainz watched calculation move behind the man's eyes, not fear, not yet, but the particular caution of a soldier reassessing an opponent he had walked in expecting to overawe. You speak with considerable confidence for someone facing an armed column, Vantras said finally. I speak with the confidence appropriate to my position, Ainz replied. You have brought several hundred soldiers and a handful of armored vehicles to my doorstep, Colonel Militant. I would ask you in turn to consider what confidence you would carry if our positions were reversed, if I had arrived at your fortress with a force whose true capabilities you could not measure, and whose patience you had not yet tested. It landed. Ainz saw it land, the faintest shift in Vantras's posture. A soldier's instinct recalculating risk against an unknown that had just deliberately declined to reveal its full hand. Behind him, Albedo remained perfectly still, radiant menace held in careful check, and Demiurge's expression carried the faint, unsettling pleasure of a being who understood exactly what game was being played and was enjoying watching it unfold. I am not authorized to negotiate territorial concessions, Vantras said finally, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly from demand towards something more careful. That authority rests with the Inquisition should this matter be escalated to their attention, which given the circumstances I believe it will be. I will withdraw my forces to a defensive perimeter. You will not be permitted to expand your presence in this system. And you should understand, Ainz Ooal Gown, that whatever confidence you carry today, the Imperium of man does not forget anomalies it cannot explain. Someone will come who is authorized to demand answers you have declined to give me. Look forward to the conversation, Ainz said, and meant it rather more literally than Vantras could possibly have understood, because whoever came next would be one step closer to helping Ainz understand a mystery he was increasingly desperate to solve. And every soldier and officer this civilization sent his way was, however unwittingly, a source of information he intended to extract with patience and precision. The Colonel Militant withdrew his column within the hour, and Ainz stood watching the dust of their retreat with a stillness that for once was not entirely performance. "That went well," Demiurge said once the column had shrunk to a distant smear on the horizon. "Though I confess, Lord Ainz, I remain curious what precisely you intended by forces that predate their survey. I do not recall that being part of any briefing." "It wasn't," Ainz admitted quietly enough that only Demiurge and Albedo could hear. "I have no more idea why we're here than I did 3 days ago, but he doesn't know that, and as long as he doesn't, we have time." "For what, my lord?" Albedo asked. Ainz looked back toward Nazarick's black spires, toward the 90 floors of secrets and power he ruled, and increasingly felt he understood less than he ever had. "Time to find out the truth before someone with more authority than a colonel arrives and demands it," he said. "Because Sebas is right about one thing, whether or not I said it aloud in that council chamber. Whatever moved us here did so with purpose. And purpose this vast does not remain hidden forever, not from them, and not, I suspect, from us either." Above them, beyond the bruised little moon and the dead stars scattered across an unfamiliar sky, something that had no name in either Nazarick's magic or the Imperium's theology continued its long, patient work. A design set in motion long before Ainz Ooal Gown had ever opened his eyes in a world not his own, and drawing with each passing hour. One measure closer to revealing why. Colonel Militant Vantras did not sleep that night either, though for reasons considerably less philosophical than Ainz's own insomnia. He sat in the command cabin of his Chimera transport, the report he was required to file glowing unfinished on the data slate before him, and found himself, for the first time in a 23-year career that had taken him through 3 campaigns and 1 attempted demonic incursion on a forge world he still had nightmares about, genuinely uncertain how to characterize what he had witnessed. The truthful version of events was, he understood, professionally dangerous to file. Being calling itself Ainz Ooal Gown, of unknown species possessing an unregistered fortification of extraordinary scale, declined to explain its presence, implied capabilities it did not demonstrate, and I withdrew rather than press the matter. Every line of that report was an admission that could end a career, or worse, invite the kind of scrutiny that ended careers by simply making the officer who filed it disappear. And yet the alternative, softening the account, downplaying what he'd seen, carried its own catastrophic risk. Because if this Ainz Ooal Gown's fortress proved to be exactly the threat his instincts screamed it might be, a falsified report would be the last mistake Vantras ever made. He chose the truth in the end because whatever else Colonel Militant Aurelio Vantras was, he was not a man who lied to the Emperor's service, whatever the personal cost. He filed the report in full, flagged it for escalation beyond his own authority, and included in the closing lines an observation he had not shared aloud with his own soldiers. Asterisk, the entity's confidence was not performed for effect alone. 23 years of field command have taught me to recognize bluster masking weakness. Whatever else Ainz Ooal Gown may be, I do not believe he was bluffing about possessing capabilities beyond what we observed. I recommend this matter receive inquisitorial attention at the earliest possible opportunity, and I recommend against further unilateral military action pending that. It was though Vantras could not have known it, the single most accurate assessment anyone in the 41st millennium would make of Ainz Ooal Gown for some time, and it was accurate for reasons that would have terrified the Colonel Militant far more than reassured him. Had he understood that the confidence he correctly identified as genuine was genuine terror wearing confidences, clothing the report reached Inquisitor Yevgenia Thal 11 hours later. Routed through channels that existed precisely for circumstances too anomalous for ordinary military hierarchy to process, and she read it twice before setting the data slate down and allowing herself a long, measured breath. Thal had spent 30 years in the Ordo Xenos hunting down exactly the kind of anomaly this report described, and in 30 years she had developed a reliable instinct for separating genuine threats from the superstitious panic of soldiers who saw demons in every unexplained shadow. This report did not read like panic. Vantras's account was clipped, precise, professionally restrained even in its most alarming details, which was, in Thal's long experience, far more concerning than hysteria would have been. Frightened soldiers exaggerated. Disciplined ones like Vantras, when they still sounded shaken beneath the discipline, were usually reporting something real. She pulled the attached sensor logs, Voidsman Oss's original survey data, cross-referenced against the Scoutcraft's readings from 4 days later, and stared for a long time at the discrepancy that had first flagged this matter for her attention days ago, before Vantras's ground report had even been filed. The null reading. The structure of that mass, appearing where no structure had been, should have registered something in the warp's shallow psychic currents, the residual hum every populated place left behind, however faint. Nazarick registered nothing. Not concealment, not shielding. Absence, total and seamless, as though the fortress and everything within it existed in a manner the warp itself had no mechanism to perceive. In 30 years hunting Xenos incursions, rogue psychers, and the occasional genuine demonic manifestation, Thal had encountered concealment of every sophistication the galaxy's hostile intelligences could devise. She had never once encountered something that did not merely hide from the warp, but that the warp itself seemed unable to register as existing at all. That distinction mattered more than anything else in Vantras's report, more than the entity's confidence, more than the fortress's impossible scale. Xenos hid, demons corrupted and lied and wore false faces, but they always left a mark upon the warp, because the warp was reflection and appetite and the accumulated psychic residue of every soul that had ever touched it, and nothing sentient acted within reality without disturbing that reflection in some way. Ainz Ooal Gown's fortress disturbed nothing. As far as the warp was concerned, it might as well not exist. Thal had a name for the very short list of phenomena capable of that particular impossibility, and every entry on that list terrified her considerably more than any conventional Xenos threat she had spent her career hunting. She began drafting her own authorization for direct investigation, and paused only once, her stylus hovering over the final line, weighing whether to include the observation that had been building in her mind since she'd first cross-referenced the sensor data. The possibility, unlikely but not yet ruled out, that Vantras's anomaly was not a threat that had entered the galaxy at all, but something the galaxy's own underlying fabric had somehow failed to account for. A gap in the pattern, rather than an intrusion upon it, she decided against including it. Some suspicions were dangerous to commit to record before they could be confirmed, and if she was right, she suspected she would have ample opportunity to revise the report in person. I am taking personal command of this investigation, she wrote instead, in the flat, unadorned language the Inquisition favored for matters too significant for embellishment. No further military action is to be taken against the entity or structure in question pending my arrival. I will require full sensor data, all personnel present during initial contact for debrief, and safe passage to the anomaly's location. This matter is classified beyond standard Ordo Xenos clearance until I determine otherwise. She signed it, sealed it, and sat for a long moment afterward in the quiet of her chambers, turning over the one detail from Vantras's report that lodged most uncomfortably in her mind. Not the fortress, not the impossible null reading, but a single line buried near the end of his account, the entity's own words as Vantras had recorded them. Forces and calculations that predate any survey your authority has ever conducted of this system. It was, Thal thought, either the emptiest bluster she had encountered in 3 decades of inquisitorial service, or it was the single most alarming sentence anyone had spoken to an Imperial officer in years. She intended to find out which before anyone else in the Imperium had the chance to make that determination for her. Inquisitor Thal's ship arrived on the 6th day, and Ainz knew of its approach before Cossidus's report reached him, not through magic, which had told him nothing useful since the moment of arrival, but through a simpler instinct he had cultivated over 2 years of rule, the particular quality of silence that preceded consequential news. A single vessel, Cossidus reported, considerably smaller than the military column, descending directly toward our perimeter rather than holding at distance. Sensor signature suggests it is unarmed or lightly armed at most. "They're not sending soldiers this time," Ainz said. "They're sending someone who thinks they don't need them." That, more than anything in Vantras's visit, told him the stakes had changed. An army was a blunt instrument, easily read, easily managed through the kind of confident theater Ainz had performed 6 days ago. A single unescorted visitor, arriving without the protection of numbers, was either supremely foolish or supremely confident in some other form of authority, and Ainz doubted, given everything he had observed of the civilization's caution, that foolishness was the more likely explanation. He received her in the throne room this time, not the open ground beyond the walls, a deliberate shift in venue, and he suspected she would understand exactly what it signaled. The location where the previous meeting had been on contested, neutral ground. This one placed her, quite literally, inside Nazarick's power, and Ainz wanted to observe how she reacted to that imbalance. She did not react to it at all, which was itself the most informative response she could have given him. Inquisitor Yevgenia Thal was smaller than Ainz had expected, spare and gray-haired beneath a hood that shadowed sharp, assessing eyes, dressed in robes that carried none of the military ornamentation Vantras had worn but radiated instead a different and in some ways more unsettling kind of authority, the authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. She walked the length of his throne room alone, past guardians who could have ended her existence in less time than it took her to draw breath, and did not so much as glance at them. Her attention fixed entirely on Ainz himself with an intensity that felt uncomfortably like being studied rather than merely observed. "Ooal Gown," she said, stopping a precise, deliberate distance from the throne, close enough to signal she felt no fear, far enough to signal she was not a supplicant. "I am Inquisitor Yevgenia Thal Ordozinos. Colonel Militant Vantras's report reached my attention. I found it interesting enough to warrant addressing personally without escort. I trust you'll understand that choice as the courtesy it's intended to be." "Do," Ainz said, and meant it. An unescorted approach into the heart of an unknown power was either a profound act of trust or a calculated demonstration that she believed herself protected by something Ainz couldn't yet see, and he found himself, despite the danger the woman clearly represented, genuinely curious which it was. "Though I confess some curiosity what an inquisitor's courtesy is worth, given I know nothing of what that title means in your Imperium." "It means," Thal said, "that I have spent 30 years identifying threats to humanity before they metastasize into catastrophes, and that I have grown very good at recognizing the difference between genuine danger and performance." Her eyes did not leave his face, or what passed for his face, the fixed architecture of bone that revealed nothing regardless of what moved beneath it. "Colonel Militant Vantras believed your confidence was genuine. I've come to determine whether he was right, or whether you're simply the most convincing performer I've encountered in 3 decades of this work." It was, Ainz thought, an almost admirably direct opening, no threats, no demands delivered with an army's weight behind them, just a blunt statement of purpose that put the entire encounter on ground he had not fully anticipated. He recalibrated quickly, understanding that whatever tactics had worked on Vantras would require adjustment for a mind this precise. "And what conclusion have you reached so far, Inquisitor?" "That I don't yet know," she said, "which is in itself unusual. I've stood before demon princes and kept my composure. I've interrogated Xeno's war leaders who could crush my skull between 2 fingers without effort. I do not as a rule find myself uncertain in the presence of a threat, Ainz Ooal Gown. You are the first thing I've encountered in a very long time that I cannot immediately categorize." She let that sit for a moment, and then continued, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly, still controlled, still measured, but carrying beneath it something that might, in a less disciplined person, have sounded like the edge of genuine unease. "I've reviewed the sensor data from your fortress's arrival. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to understand that your answer or your refusal to answer will tell me a great deal regardless of which you choose." "Ask." "Your fortress produces no psychic resonance," Thal said. "None, not concealed, absent. In 30 years hunting things that hide from the warp, I have never encountered anything that the warp itself fails to register as real. I want to know what you are, Ainz Ooal Gown, that leaves no mark on the fabric every other living, thinking thing in this galaxy disturbs simply by existing." The chamber went very still. Ainz had spent 6 days constructing a careful architecture of implication and unstated threat, a performance built entirely on the premise that he understood more than he revealed. That architecture depended at its foundation on never being asked a question he could not answer with at least the appearance of calculated withholding rather than genuine ignorance. This question he could not answer at all, not with performance, not with implication. He did not know what the warp was precisely, had gathered only fragments from Sebas's careful compilation of scattered military terminology, and had absolutely no framework for understanding why Nazarick would fail to register within it, because he had never known such a thing as the warp existed until a woman with tired, sharp eyes had just described his own home's absence from it, as though it were the most alarming fact she'd encountered in 30 years of hunting monsters. He felt, for one suspended moment, the particular vertigo of a performer who has just been asked to demonstrate the one trick he does not actually know how to do then. With the same instinct that had carried him through 2 years of ruling a domain built on careful theater, Ainz chose the only path available to him that was not an outright lie he could not sustain under further scrutiny. "I don't know," he said. It was, he understood even as he said it, possibly the single most dangerous sentence he had spoken since arriving in this galaxy, an admission of ignorance from a being who had built his entire strategy on the appearance of total command. And yet something in Thal's question, in the genuine uncertainty beneath her controlled exterior, told him that this, of all moments, was not one where the old performance would serve him. This woman had spent 30 years learning to detect exactly the kind of hollow confidence he deployed against Vantras. Deploying it against her now would not buy him time. It would confirm her worst suspicions. "I don't know," he said again, more steadily, "what your warp is in any detail beyond fragments my people have gathered from your own soldiers' terminology. I don't know why my home fails to register within it. I don't know why we were brought to this galaxy at all, Inquisitor Thal, and I have spent 6 days performing certainty I do not possess because the alternative, admitting to an unknown, potentially hostile power that I am as lost as anyone standing before me, struck me as considerably more dangerous than the lie." Thal was silent for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that felt, for the first time since she'd entered the throne room, genuinely uncertain rather than clinically assessing. "That is either the most reckless honesty I've encountered from a potential threat in my entire career," she said slowly, "or it is the single most sophisticated manipulation anyone has ever attempted on me. I confess I do not yet know which." "Neither do I know how to prove which it is," Ainz admitted. "I can only tell you that everything I have described is true. My home was taken from its world by a force I do not understand, brought here by means I cannot explain, and set down in a galaxy where nothing, not my magic, not my divinations, not any tool I possess, can tell me why. If your warp finds no trace of us, Inquisitor, I promise you that fact troubles me considerably more than it troubles you. You at least have a framework within which to be troubled. I do not even have that." It was the truest thing he had said to anyone outside Nazarick since arriving in this galaxy, and Ainz felt the particular exposure of having offered a genuine vulnerability to someone who had made clear, in every measured word, that she possessed both the will and the capability to exploit it. Thal studied him a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, something in her rigid posture eased, not trust precisely, but a shift toward a different mode of engagement, the recalculation of a hunter who has just realized her quarry might not be quarry at all. "There is a division within my order," she said slowly, "that concerns itself with phenomena that fall outside conventional categories of threat, things that are neither cleanly xenos, nor demonic, nor heretical in any framework our doctrine readily accommodates. I have spent my career in a simpler division, Ainz Ooal Gown, hunting threats that at least announce themselves honestly as threats. I confess I do not know which division your fortress belongs to, and that uncertainty is in itself the most significant finding I intend to report." "What will you report?" "The truth," Thal said, "that something has entered this galaxy that neither the warp nor imperial doctrine nor 30 years of my own experience can adequately explain. That its ruler either does not know why it is here, or is lying about not knowing with a sophistication I have never before encountered. And that I do not, at this time, recommend military action because I do not understand what we would be fighting, or whether it can be fought at all through means we currently possess." She turned to leave and then paused, looking back at him with an expression that carried, beneath its careful control, something that might almost have been sympathy, one uncertain intelligence acknowledging another. "What it's worth," she said, "if you're telling the truth, Ainz Ooal Gown, I would offer you the same warning I would offer any lost thing in a galaxy this hostile. Whatever you are, whatever brought you here, you should understand that the warp's silence regarding your existence has not gone unnoticed by only the Imperium. There are other powers in this galaxy that watch the warp far more closely than I do, and far less kindly. If something exists that the warp cannot perceive, I promise you, they will want very badly to understand why, and their methods of inquiry are considerably less courteous than mine." She left without waiting for a response, and Ainz stood alone in his throne room long after her ship had cleared the horizon, turning her final words over with a dread that settled somewhere beneath the composed architecture of his borrowed face. Other powers that watch the warp far more closely. He did not yet know what those words meant precisely, or which powers she referred to. But he understood, with the same instinct that had carried him through every uncertain moment since Nazarick's arrival, that Inquisitor Thal's warning was not idle courtesy. Somewhere in the vast dark beyond this galaxy's dead stars, something had already begun to notice the silence where Nazarick should have left a mark. And silence, Ainz suspected, was about to become the very thing that drew every eye in the 41st millennium toward his door. The warning Thal left behind did not take long to prove itself accurate, though what came next was not another vessel, another army, or another emissary bearing questions Ainz could not honestly answer. What came next arrived without ships at all, and announced itself first not to Nazarick, but to the mind of a single unremarkable psyker 3 systems away, a young astropath named Corin de Levesque, seated in the meditative trance required of her duties, relaying routine astropathic traffic between garrison worlds, when something in the warp's boundless dark turned its attention toward her with the casual, incidental violence of something vast noticing something small. She did not survive the encounter unscathed. What she experienced, what she would later struggle weeping to describe to the sanctioned psychers who found her collapsed and bleeding from the eyes at her station, was not an attack in any conventional sense. It was closer to being looked at. Pressure sweeping across the warp's currents, searching, cataloging, indifferent to the countless mortal minds it brushed against in passing, until it found something that was not there at all, a shape defined entirely by its absence, a hole in the tapestry where a soul shadow should have been, and paused. "It felt me feeling it," de Levesque told the black ship's crew who came to collect her 3 days later, her voice reduced to a fractured whisper. "Whatever it was, it knew I'd noticed the nothing. And it didn't like being noticing." Her report, garbled and traumatized as it was, would eventually reach Inquisitor Thal's desk alongside a dozen similar fragments, other astropaths across the sector reporting the same disturbance in the same window of time, all describing in their own broken vocabularies, the sensation of something ancient and patient turning its attention briefly toward the coordinates where Nazarick sat. None of them could say what it was. All of them agreed on one thing: whatever had looked toward that null space in the warp had not been looking with curiosity alone. There had been hunger in it, and calculation, and something that felt, to more than one traumatized astropath, uncomfortably like recognition. Ainz knew none of this directly. What he knew was that on the 9th day since Nazarick's arrival, Demiurge's divination rituals, which had produced nothing but static and silence since the first attempt, suddenly, violently produced something else entirely. Ainz. Demiurge's voice, when he burst into the throne room, carried an urgency Ainz had rarely heard from his most composed guardian. The scrying ritual, it did not fail this time, it was answered. "Answered how? I do not have adequate words," Demiurge admitted, which alarmed Ainz more than almost anything else could have. "I initiated the ritual as I have 9 times previously, expecting the same resistance. Instead, for perhaps 3 seconds the ritual completed and something looked back through it. Not a vision, Lord Ainz, a presence, aware of the ritual, aware of me, aware, I believe, of all of Nazarick in the span of those 3 seconds." "What did it show you?" Demiurge hesitated, which was itself unprecedented. "Fragments, impossible to interpret with confidence. A vastness of stars, but wrong, layered, folded, as though space itself were a page being read rather than a place being observed. And beneath that vastness, a architecture, for lack of a better word. Vast beyond anything Nazarick's scale could compare to. Ancient in a way that made 2 years or 2,000 years feel like the span of a single breath." "This presence," Ainz said slowly. "Did it communicate anything, any intention?" "One impression," Demiurge said. "I cannot be certain I interpreted it correctly given the brevity of the contact, but it felt, Lord Ainz, less like an attack and more like an inventory being taken. As though something vast was cataloging an asset it had recently acquired, and found the asset's continued ignorance of its own nature mildly inconvenient." Ainz absorbed this in silence, turning the fragmentary report over with the same careful attention he gave every scrap of information in a world that had offered him almost none since his arrival. An inventory being taken. An asset recently acquired. The language troubled him precisely because it did not sound like the language of a hostile power assessing a threat. It sounded like the language of an owner checking on something it already possessed. Demiurge, he said carefully. Is it possible, and I ask this understanding how it may sound, that whatever moved Nazarick to this galaxy did not do so as an act of hostility at all? That we were not attacked or exiled or stolen but retrieved, Demiurge finished, and Ainz heard for the first time in 2 years something that might have been genuine unease in his most unflappable guardian's voice. Retrieved implies ownership, Lord Ainz. It implies that whatever brought us here believes it had the right to do so. I confess I find that possibility considerably more disturbing than the alternative. So did Ainz, though he kept that admission to himself, because a being who ruled Nazarick could survive being an unwelcome anomaly in a hostile galaxy. He was considerably less certain what it would mean to be instead a possession whose true owner had simply decided after some unknowable span of time to reclaim what belonged to it. He did not have long to sit with that unease before Aura arrived with a report that added a fresh and immediate complication to an already impossible week. Lord Ainz's new contact, but this one's different from the others. Doesn't match the Imperium's ships at all. Different design, different approach vector, and whatever it is, it's not being cautious, it's coming in fast. Ainz followed her to the outer wall in time to see it. Vessel unlike Vantras's utilitarian craft or Thal's understated transport. Its hull marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of perception, colors that did not sit comfortably in Ainz's field of vision, an aesthetic that combined Baroque, almost decadent ornamentation with an undercurrent of something that made every instinct Ainz possessed, instincts built across a very long life of navigating dangerous, deceptive beings, scream a single wordless warning. Asterisk, do not trust anything that arrives wearing beauty as a weapon. Asterisk, the vessel did not circle cautiously the way the Imperial scout had. It descended directly, landing with an unhurried confidence that Ainz recognized immediately as a mirror of his own performed certainty. Except he suspected, watching the ramp lower and a lone figure emerge into the bruised moonlight, that this visitor's confidence was not performance at all. The figure who walked toward Nazarick's outer wall moved with a fluid, unhurried grace that seemed almost choreographed, robes shifting through colors that had no fixed name. A presence that struck Ainz, even at a distance, even through senses honed across a very long life, as fundamentally, deeply wrong in a way neither Vantras's soldiers nor Thal's careful authority had been. Ooal Gown, the figure called out, voice carrying an amused musical lilt that made every guardian within earshot bristle with instinctive hostility. Ruler of a fortress that casts no shadow in the warp. Do you have any idea how asterisk rare that makes you? How interesting asterisk? You have the advantage of me, Ainz replied, keeping his tone level despite the unease coiling through him. You know my name, I do not yet know yours, nor the nature of the power you represent. Figure smiled, an expression that revealed too many teeth, arranged in a pattern that was almost but not quite natural. You may call me Vessel of the Ninefold Path if names matter to you at all, though I suspect what actually matters is that I bring an offer rather than a demand, unlike the tedious soldiers who visited you previously. The figure spread its arms, gesturing at the black spires of Nazarick with theatrical appreciation. My patron has taken considerable interest in your arrival, Ainz Ooal Gown. A being that exists outside the warp's perception is either the greatest threat this galaxy has faced in 10,000 years or the greatest opportunity. My patron would very much like to determine which, and would very much prefer to make that determination as an ally rather than an obstacle. Your patron, Ainz said carefully. And who might that be? The figure's smile widened, and behind it, Ainz thought he glimpsed for just a moment something vast and hungry looking out through eyes that were no longer entirely the eyes of the being standing before him. Oh, it said, delighted. We have so much to discuss. Ainz did not move, did not allow so much as a flicker of the unease coiling through him to reach the fixed architecture of his borrowed face. Though every instinct honed across 2 years of ruling Nazarick screamed that the being before him was dangerous in a register entirely different from anything he had yet encountered in this galaxy. Vantras had been a soldier following orders, predictable within the logic of martial hierarchy. Thal had been a hunter, dangerous but honest in her uncertainty. This thing wearing the shape of a herald was neither. It watched him with an attention that felt less like observation and more like a held door, an invitation Ainz understood on some level below conscious thought would cost him something significant to walk through. You offer discussion, Ainz said, but you have not yet told me what your patron wants, only that they want something. Forgive me if I find that insufficient grounds for continuing this conversation. Direct, the herald said, sounding pleased rather than rebuffed. I appreciate that. Very well, my patron is a god of change, of possibility, of the countless futures that branch from every choice a thinking creature makes. He watches this galaxy's endless, tedious insistence on stagnation with something between amusement and hunger. And you, Ainz Ooal Gown, the herald's too-many-teeth smile widened further, you are the single most interesting variable to enter his field of vision in centuries. Being the warp cannot perceive is a being whose future my patron cannot read. Do you understand how vanishingly rare that is? How maddening and how delicious asterisk. You're saying your patron cannot predict me, Ainz said slowly, turning the information over with genuine interest despite the danger radiating from the figure before him. That my presence here represents a blind spot in whatever power he ordinarily wields. Blind spot, the herald agreed, or a door. My patron has not yet decided which, and that uncertainty delights him more than I suspect you can appreciate. He would like to know more about you before deciding, and in exchange for that knowledge, he offers gifts considerable enough to make even a being with your evident self-possession consider the trade seriously. Power beyond what you currently wield. Knowledge of this galaxy's true architecture, the kind your Imperium's frightened little soldiers could never provide. Perhaps even, the herald's voice dropped, conspiratorial, in answer to the very question you're most desperate to have answered, why you are here at all. Ainz felt something cold move through him at that final offer, precisely because it targeted the one vulnerability he could not fully armor against, the raw annoying uncertainty that had haunted every hour since Nazarick's arrival. Whatever this herald's patron was, it had correctly identified the exact shape of the wound it hoped to exploit. That, more than anything else the creature had said, told Ainz everything he needed to know about how to respond. You offer knowledge, Ainz said, in exchange for what precisely? Beings who deal in temptation rarely name their price honestly on the first offer, and I have ruled long enough to recognize the shape of a bargain designed to cost more than it promises. Herald laughed, a sound like wind chimes struck by something that did not understand music, but had learned to imitate its patterns. Oh, you asterisk are asterisk interesting. Very well, no games this once. My patron asks only for access. A thread of connection between your fortress and his attention, small enough to seem inconsequential, useful enough to let him study what the warp cannot show him directly. In exchange, he offers guidance and protection from complications that your continued presence here is already beginning to attract. Complications, Ainz repeated. You have made an impression, Ainz Ooal Gown, in less than 2 weeks on entities considerably older and considerably less patient than my patron. The Imperium fears you as an unknown. My patron finds you fascinating as a puzzle. But there are older things still, sleeping beneath this galaxy's floor, that do not fear or find fascination, only appetite. A being that cannot be perceived by the warp is also, I should mention, a being that cannot be perceived by certain defenses that rely upon that same perception. You are not merely interesting, little king. You are exposed in ways your ancient magic has not yet taught you to recognize. Ainz absorbed this with the same careful stillness he brought to every piece of information in this maddeningly unfamiliar galaxy, weighing the herald's words against everything Thal had already warned him, against the unsettling report Demiurge had delivered not an hour before of something vast taking inventory of an asset it believed it already owned. Two very different powers, in the span of a single day, both circling the same unsettling truth, that Nazarick's invisibility to the warp was not merely a curiosity, but a genuine and perhaps catastrophic vulnerability, one Ainz did not yet understand well enough to defend against. That the herald's patron wished to exploit that vulnerability rather than warn him out of pure altruism was, Ainz suspected, the least surprising part of the entire exchange. I will consider your offer, Ainz said finally, as I consider all offers carefully and without haste. But I will not grant access to my fortress, however small the thread, to a power I do not understand, offered by a herald who has not once in this entire conversation told me the true name of the one he serves. Something shifted behind the herald's too wide smile, not anger precisely but a recalibration, the expression of a being accustomed to eventual acquiescence, recognizing, with something like renewed interest, that this particular negotiation would not resolve so easily. Caution, the herald mused. How refreshingly old-fashioned. Very well, Ainz Ooal Gown, I will not press further today. My patron delights in patience almost as much as he delights in change, and I suspect the games ahead will prove considerably more entertaining than a bargain struck too quickly. The figure stepped backward toward its waiting vessel, robes shifting through colors that still had no names Ainz's vocabulary could supply. But understand this before I go, you are being watched now by more than soldiers and inquisitors. The old powers of this galaxy have noticed the hole you leave in their sight, and holes, little king, invite curious fingers. I would think carefully about who you allow to reach through first. The vessel's ramp sealed behind the herald, and it lifted from the barren ground with the same unhurried confidence with which it had arrived, banking away into the star-strewn dark and leaving Ainz standing at Nazarick's outer wall with a dread that settled far deeper than anything Vantras's soldiers or even Thal's careful warnings had managed to instill. Lord Ainz. Albedo's voice, close beside him, carried a rare tremor of genuine concern. What was that thing? I don't know, Ainz admitted, watching the strange vessel shrink into the dark. But whatever it serves, it wanted something from us badly enough to offer answers I don't have the luxury of refusing forever. And it warned me, whether from genuine concern or simple manipulation, I cannot yet tell, that we are not merely visible to this galaxy's dangers now. We are interesting to them, which may prove considerably more dangerous than being merely unwelcome. He turned back toward Nazarick's black spires, the 90 floors of power and secrets he had ruled for 2 years, and understood, with each passing day in this galaxy, less completely than he had believed just 2 weeks ago. Assemble the council, he said. I need Demiurge's full account of what the divination showed him, cross-referenced against everything this herald implied. If 2 entirely separate powers have both, within the same day, suggested that something ancient already considers Nazarick a possession or a puzzle rather than an intruder, he stopped, the thought crystallizing into something he did not want to voice aloud but could no longer avoid. Then whatever brought us here, he finished quietly, may not be finished with us yet. And I suspect the true reason for our arrival is not a mystery this galaxy's factions will solve for us. It is one we will have to uncover ourselves, before something far older decides to stop waiting for us to understand, and simply comes to collect what it believes already belongs to it. Behind him, the bruised moon climbed higher over a landscape that 3 weeks ago had known nothing of gods, kings, or the vast, patient architecture that had reached across the boundaries of reality itself to place the great tomb of Nazarick exactly where something, somewhere, had always intended it to be. Ainz did not move, did not allow so much as a flicker of the unease coiling through him to reach the fixed architecture of his borrowed face, though every instinct honed across 2 years of ruling Nazarick screamed that the being before him was dangerous in a register entirely different from anything he had yet encountered in this galaxy. Vantras had been a soldier following orders, predictable within the logic of martial hierarchy. Thal had been a hunter, dangerous but honest in her uncertainty. This thing wearing the shape of a herald was neither. It watched him with an attention that felt less like observation and more like a held door, an invitation Ainz understood on some level below conscious thought would cost him something significant to walk through. You offer discussion, Ainz said, but you have not yet told me what your patron wants, only that they want something. Forgive me if I find that insufficient grounds for continuing this conversation. Direct, the herald said, sounding pleased rather than rebuffed. I appreciate that. Very well, my patron is a god of change, of possibility, of the countless futures that branch from every choice a thinking creature makes. He watches this galaxy's endless, tedious insistence on stagnation with something between amusement and hunger. And you, Ainz Ooal Gown, the herald's too many teeth smile widened further, you are the single most interesting variable to enter his field of vision in centuries. Being the warp cannot perceive is a being whose future my patron cannot read. Do you understand how vanishingly rare that is? How maddening and how delicious asterisk. You're saying your patron cannot predict me, Ainz said slowly, turning the information over with genuine interest despite the danger radiating from the figure before him. That my presence here represents a blind spot in whatever power he ordinarily wields. Blind spot, the herald agreed, or a door. My patron has not yet decided which, and that uncertainty delights him more than I suspect you can appreciate. He would like to know more about you before deciding, and in exchange for that knowledge, he offers gifts considerable enough to make even a being with your evident self-possession consider the trade seriously. Power beyond what you currently wield. Knowledge of this galaxy's true architecture, the kind your Imperium's frightened little soldiers could never provide. Perhaps even, the herald's voice dropped, conspiratorial, in answer to the very question you're most desperate to have answered, why you are here at all. Ainz felt something cold move through him at that final offer, precisely because it targeted the one vulnerability he could not fully armor against, the raw annoying uncertainty that had haunted every hour since Nazarick's arrival. Whatever this herald's patron was, it had correctly identified the exact shape of the wound it hoped to exploit. That, more than anything else the creature had said, told Ainz everything he needed to know about how to respond. You offer knowledge, Ainz said, in exchange for what precisely? Beings who deal in temptation rarely name their price honestly on the first offer. And I have ruled long enough to recognize the shape of a bargain designed to cost more than it promises. Harold laughed, a sound like wind chimes struck by something that did not understand music, but had learned to imitate its patterns. Oh, you asterisk are asterisk interesting. Very well, no games this once. My patron asks only for access. A thread of connection between your fortress and his attention, small enough to seem inconsequential, useful enough to let him study what the warp cannot show him directly. In exchange, he offers guidance and protection from complications that your continued presence here is already beginning to attract. Complications, Ainz repeated. You have made an impression, Ainz Ooal Gown, in less than 2 weeks on entities considerably older and considerably less patient than my patron. The Imperium fears you as an unknown. My patron finds you fascinating as a puzzle. But there are older things still, sleeping beneath this galaxy's floor, that do not fear or find fascination, only appetite. A being that cannot be perceived by the warp is also, I should mention, a being that cannot be perceived by certain defenses that rely upon that same perception. You are not merely interesting, little king. You are exposed in ways your ancient magic has not yet taught you to recognize. Ainz absorbed this with the same careful stillness he brought to every piece of information in this maddeningly unfamiliar galaxy, weighing the herald's words against everything Thal had already warned him, against the unsettling report Demiurge had delivered not an hour before of something vast taking inventory of an asset it believed it already owned. Two very different powers, in the span of a single day, both circling the same unsettling truth, that Nazarick's invisibility to the warp was not merely a curiosity, but a genuine and perhaps catastrophic vulnerability, one Ainz did not yet understand well enough to defend against. That the herald's patron wished to exploit that vulnerability rather than warn him out of pure altruism was, Ainz suspected, the least surprising part of the entire exchange. I will consider your offer, Ainz said finally, as I consider all offers carefully and without haste. But I will not grant access to my fortress, however small the thread, to a power I do not understand, offered by a herald who has not once in this entire conversation told me the true name of the one he serves. Something shifted behind the herald's too-wide smile, not anger precisely but a recalibration, the expression of a being accustomed to eventual acquiescence, recognizing, with something like renewed interest, that this particular negotiation would not resolve so easily. Caution, the herald mused. How refreshingly old-fashioned. Very well, Ainz Ooal Gown, I will not press further today. My patron delights in patience almost as much as he delights in change, and I suspect the games ahead will prove considerably more entertaining than a bargain struck too quickly. The figure stepped backward toward its waiting vessel, robes shifting through colors that still had no names Ainz's vocabulary could supply. But understand this before I go, you are being watched now by more than soldiers and inquisitors. The old powers of this galaxy have noticed the hole you leave in their sight, and holes, little king, invite curious fingers. I would think carefully about who you allow to reach through first. The vessel's ramp sealed behind the herald, and it lifted from the barren ground with the same unhurried confidence with which it had arrived, banking away into the star-strewn dark and leaving Ainz standing at Nazarick's outer wall with a dread that settled far deeper than anything Vantras's soldiers or even Thal's careful warnings had managed to instill. Lord Ainz. Albedo's voice, close beside him, carried a rare tremor of genuine concern. What was that thing? I don't know, Ainz admitted, watching the strange vessel shrink into the dark. But whatever it serves, it wanted something from us badly enough to offer answers I don't have the luxury of refusing forever. And it warned me, whether from genuine concern or simple manipulation, I cannot yet tell, that we are not merely visible to this galaxy's dangers now. We are asterisk interesting to them, which may prove considerably more dangerous than being merely unwelcome. He turned back toward Nazarick's black spires, the 90 floors of power and secrets he had ruled for 2 years and understood with each passing day in this galaxy less completely than he had believed just 2 weeks ago. Assemble the council, he said. I need Demiurge's full account of what the divination showed him, cross-referenced against everything this herald implied. If 2 entirely separate powers have both, within the same day, suggested that something ancient already considers Nazarick a possession or a puzzle rather than an intruder, he stopped, the thought crystallizing into something he did not want to voice aloud but could no longer avoid. Then whatever brought us here, he finished quietly, may not be finished with us yet. And I suspect the true reason for our arrival is not a mystery this galaxy's factions will solve for us. It is one we will have to uncover ourselves, before something far older decides to stop waiting for us to understand. and simply comes to collect what it believes already belongs to it. Behind him, the bruised moon climbed higher over a landscape that 3 weeks ago had known nothing of gods, kings, or the vast, patient architecture that had reached across the boundaries of reality itself to place the great tomb of Nazarick exactly where something, somewhere, had always intended it to be. The council did not adjourn until well past what Ainz had come to think of, out of habit rather than necessity. As midnight, Demiurge's account of the 3-second vision cross-examined from every angle the Guardians could conceive. The heralds' offer dissected for every possible implication. Sebas's careful compilation of Imperial terminology cross-referenced against both, until a picture began to emerge that satisfied no one and reassured no one, least of all Ainz himself. What emerged in the end was not an answer but a shape around the absence of one. Two vast and ancient powers, alien to each other in every respect that mattered, had both independently identified Nazarick's invisibility to something called the warp as significant beyond mere curiosity. One treated it as an asset already claimed. The other treated it as a puzzle worth courting. Neither had offered the thing Ainz actually needed, which was simply an explanation, not of what Nazarick represented to them, but of why it had been moved here at all, by whom, and for what purpose that predated either power's interest. He dismissed the council near what would have been dawn, had this world possessed a sun that rose in any way Ainz's borrowed instincts recognized, and sat alone in his throne room in the particular quiet that came only after everyone who depended on his certainty had finally stopped watching him for it. It was in that quiet, with no guardian present to perform for, that Ainz Ooal Gown finally allowed himself to think the thought he had been holding at arm's length since the throne room first lurched sideways through a wrongness with no name. I do not know why I am here. I do not know if I will ever know. And every choice I have made since arriving has been built on the desperate hope that confidence deployed convincingly enough might substitute for an answer I do not possess. It was, he reflected, not so different from the 2 years before this, from waking as Ainz Ooal Gown in a body he had never asked for, ruling a domain built by others and populated by beings who loved him with a devotion he had done nothing in his old life to earn. He had built an entire philosophy of leadership on exactly this kind of performed certainty, and it had worked more or less, because the new world's dangers had at least been dangers he could eventually categorize, understand, outthink. This was different. This was uncertainty stacked upon uncertainty, an absence at the very center of the mystery that no amount of careful strategy could fill, because strategy required at least a partial map of the territory, and Ainz possessed none at all. He was still sitting with that thought, alone in the candlelight he did not need, when something changed. It was subtle at first, a pressure at the edge of his awareness, similar in quality to the sensation that had preceded Nazarick's displacement from its original world, but smaller, more contained, as though whatever vast force had moved an entire fortress across the boundaries of reality was now, delicately, reaching toward something considerably more specific. Ainz went very still, every instinct he possessed sharpening toward the source of the disturbance, and found to his genuine astonishment that it was not external at all. It was coming from within Nazarick itself, from the depths of the treasury where the tomb's oldest and most carefully guarded artifacts had rested, undisturbed, since long before Ainz had ever assumed rulership of the guild that built this place. He rose without summoning albedo, without calling for Demiurge or Sebas or any of the guardians whose counsel he would ordinarily seek before investigating anything unusual within Nazarick's own walls. Some instinct, half caution and half a need he did not fully examine, telling him that whatever was happening required, for now, only himself as witness. The treasury's deepest vault had not been opened in the 2 years since Ainz's awakening. Held items even he had never fully cataloged, artifacts inherited from the guild members who had built Nazarick centuries before its transformation into this world. Relics whose purpose had been lost even to the exhaustive records Mamunga had once, in another life, spent countless hours documenting. He descended toward it now with a growing certainty that whatever called to him originated there, among the oldest and least understood remnants of a world he had left behind entirely. He found it in a corner he did not remember ever having cataloged personally, a small, unassuming data crystal, the kind of artifact that had once, in the game that had shaped his old life, held nothing more significant than cosmetic records or minor achievement logs. It should have been inert, it should have meant nothing. Instead, it pulsed faintly with a light that had no source Ainz could identify, and as he lifted it, the pressure he had felt moments before sharpened into something almost like recognition, not his own recognition, but the artifacts as though it had been waiting, patient beyond any reasonable measure of time, for exactly this moment to finally activate. Fragments of data unspooled directly into his awareness, not through any interface he recognized, not through magic or technology he could categorize, but through a channel that felt disturbingly, as though it bypassed his current existence entirely and spoke instead to something older, to Mamanga, the man who had once in a life that felt impossibly distant now, spent countless hours building and cataloging a world that had eventually become real in ways no one, not even its creators, had ever intended. *root access fragment DETECTED. The impression read in a language that was not quite language, concepts arriving faster than words could carry them. Worldroot architecture, partial recovery, source integrity, COMPROMISED. Query origin. Unconfirmed. Ainz stood frozen, the crystal warm and pulsing in his skeletal hand, as further fragments assembled themselves into something approaching coherence. Not an explanation, not yet, but the unmistakable shape of one, glimpsed at a distance too great to fully resolve. This world was never fully separate from what came before it. The fragment seemed to convey, though whether through words or some more direct transmission of meaning. Ainz could not afterward say with certainty. The boundary was thought absolute. It was not. Something was always able to reach across, given sufficient cause. Given sufficient, the fragment guttered, the crystal's faint light dimming as though the effort of conveying even this much had exhausted whatever remained of its function, and Ainz was left standing alone in the depths of his own treasury, holding an artifact that had just confirmed, in the most oblique and maddening way possible, the one possibility he had not allowed himself to fully consider until this exact moment. Nazarick's arrival here was not an intrusion from outside this galaxy's natural order. It was a continuation, a thread reaching forward from the world Ainz had once called Yggdrasil, a world he had believed sealed away entirely the moment he awoke as Ainz Ooal Gown in a body and a life he had never chosen, but which had apparently all along retained some connection to what it had once been. A connection that something he still did not know what, still did not know why now rather than at any point in the 2 years since his transformation, had finally, deliberately decided to use. He was not merely displaced. He was retrieved exactly as Demiurge had feared, but not by any power native to this galaxy at all. By something that had always, in some sense he could not yet fully comprehend, considered Nazarick, considered him, never fully beyond its reach. The crystal went dark in his hand, its fragment of data exhausted, its message delivered in pieces too incomplete to form a full understanding but more than sufficient to reshape entirely the question Ainz had been asking since the moment his throne room first lurched through a wrongness with no name. He had been asking, why did this galaxy pull me here? That question, he understood now, standing alone in the depths of his own treasury with a dead crystal cooling in his palm, had never been the right one to ask at all. The real question, the one that would define everything Nazarick faced from this moment forward, against Imperium and chaos and whatever older, hungrier things still slept beneath this galaxy's floor, was infinitely more unsettling. What in the world I thought I'd left behind forever wanted me found again? And what will it want, now that it has succeeded? Ainz Ooal Gown stood alone in the dark of his own treasury for a long time after the crystal's light finally died completely. And for once with no guardian present to perform certainty for, he allowed himself simply to be afraid. Not of the Imperium's soldiers, not of the herald's honeyed offers, not even of whatever ancient hunger slept beneath this galaxy's surface, but of a truth he was only beginning to grasp. That the mystery of his arrival here had never been a question this galaxy could answer. It had been waiting all along inside the one place he had never thought to look, inside himself. The Emperor protects, the warp watches, and somewhere something that was never fully left behind has just been found again. More stories await.